Welcome to Henry VIII Unit 3, Lesson 3. Before we begin this lesson, I just want to reiterate the three types of exam questions that you will get. The first one will be describe two features of, and this will be worth 4 marks. The second question that you will have to tackle is explain why, 12 marks. And for this we would be expecting 3 good explanations. And the last question, that statement question, whereby you're then asked how far do you agree? And this is worth 16 marks. So this is where we would like you to look at both sides. So try and begin by literally stating your opinion, back that up with evidence, also mention that there is a counter argument, and then consider why in your conclusion you would disagree with that counter argument. So today we are going to look at who opposed the Reformation. Now, Henry's break from Rome would have an important impact on the lives of ordinary people who believed if you did not follow the teachings of the church, then you would go to hell. And this is something that we touched upon in previous lessons. To the people of England, heaven and hell were two important aspects of their lives. Now, despite this, the vast majority of the people of England seem to have accepted the Reformation, although this may well have been due to fear, or rather than loyalty to Henry. However, there are going to be some individuals who would speak out and make a stand. These were Thomas More, Elizabeth Barton, and John Fisher. The first things we'd like you to do is literally to write the date and the title in your book, or on paper, or in a document. As in previous lessons, we like to start off with a starter quiz. You have 3 questions here. Give yourself a certain amount of time, perhaps 5 or 6 minutes. So the first question is, which act meant the death penalty for anybody challenging royal supremacy? Number 2, which oath did people have to take? And 3, what position was Cromwell appointed to which allowed him to use the king's power in spiritual matters? Okay, we've got the answers to these. Hopefully you got all 3 right. For the first one, it clearly was indeed the Treason Act of 1534. Likewise, everybody had to swear an oath, or the oath of succession, and the Vicegerent or Vicar General was the answer to number 3. Mark your answers. If you didn't get the question right, write it out in a full sentence. So we're now going to look at 3 important individuals who opposed the Reformation. Now I take you back to that very first question on the paper where you're asked to give 2 key features, and these people we're going to look at might quite easily fit in with that question. So the first one then, we're going to look at Elizabeth Barton. At 16, Elizabeth Barton had visions of the Virgin Mary. People began to flock to see her as they believed she was a messenger from God. She became known as the Holy Maid of Kent, or the Nun of Kent. Elizabeth claimed that if Henry married Anne Boleyn, he would die. When Henry visited Canterbury Cathedral, he was met by Elizabeth, who told him what she thought. Often Elizabeth would enter into a trance, her face became distorted, she spoke without moving her lips, and her voice took on a terrifying tone when describing hell. Now, Elizabeth Barton had a number of beliefs. For example, she felt that you should burn the English translations of the Bible, you should stay loyal to the Pope. She argued God approved Mass and pilgrimages. And as we've mentioned earlier, when she met Henry VIII in 1532, she warned him that if he married Anne Boleyn, he would die a villain's death within a month. Elizabeth Barton, was she real or a fake? Well, it's obviously impossible to know, but she may have been exploited by some clergy opposed to Henry's policies. Certainly Dr. Edward Bocking, her spiritual advisor, published a collection of her prophecies in the Nun's Book. In July 1533, Henry ordered Cromwell to act. This was because she had prophesied that Henry would not last a further month on the throne. Now, clearly this posed a problem for Henry, as he did not want people to be inspired to resist his reforms, so Cromwell was ordered to act. So what happened? Well, Elizabeth was charged with high treason and condemned by an Act of Attainder. This Act of Parliament was used to stop people actually going to trial. In July 1533, she was taken to the Tower of London and interrogated, and in the same month all 700 copies of the Nun's Book were seized and destroyed. Not a single copy survives. By November 1533, Elizabeth is publicly humiliated at St. Paul's Cross in London and forced to confess to lying about her visions. On the 21st of April 1534, Elizabeth is executed for treason along with Edward Bocking. Incidentally, this was the same day the Londoners were required to swear the oath of succession. Our second individual that we need to be aware of is John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. Now, Bishop Fisher had been chaplain to Margaret Beaufort, Henry's grandmother, and Fisher had supported Catherine of Aragon and the Pope. Although the government tried to silence him, he still spoke out. And at this time there was very little Henry could do because Fisher had not broken any laws. Fisher's argument was that Henry was lawfully wedded to Catherine of Aragon. He was opposed to the split with Rome, as he believed the Pope's powers came from God, and therefore Henry was committing a mortal sin by claiming them as his own. Now, some bishops agreed with Fisher privately, but publicly supported Henry. Now, when it was later found out that John Fisher had links with Elizabeth Barton, then they could start to act. Seriously ill by 1534, Fisher led the opposition to Henry and refused to swear the oath of succession and the oath of supremacy. The Pope made Fisher a cardinal in the hope that this would stop Henry from executing him. Fisher secretly appealed to Charles V to invade, although no reply was received. Eventually, Fisher is taken to the Tower of London because he refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as the rightful queen. As previously mentioned, the Pope made Fisher a cardinal, hoping that this would prevent Henry from executing him. It failed, and in 1535 Fisher was executed. Had Henry known that Fisher had contacted Charles V asking him to invade England, this execution may well have happened earlier. And finally we come to the last of our three individuals, Sir Thomas More, one of Europe's leading scholars. As an international renowned scholar, he wrote a famous book called Utopia, in which a perfect society lived on a small island. Some people suggest this is England. More was very critical of the Catholic faith, but this was before Luther. More strongly reacted against Luther. He was a devout Catholic with little religious toleration. He believed Protestantism threatened the very souls of the English people. On the fall of Wolsey in 1529, he was made Chancellor, even though Henry knew he was against the divorce. In 1530, More refused to sign a letter asking the Pope to annul the marriage of Catherine of Aragon. Henry accepted More's request to be relieved of his duties. He would eventually be executed in 1535. Now, More refused to say anything about the king. This ultimately was going to make it very difficult for a charge of treason to be made against him. However, the Solicitor General, a man called Richard Rich, spoke to him in prison and then claimed More had spoken treasonable comments. It is probable that Rich's accusations were made up, but at the trial they were accepted and More was found guilty. He was executed on the 6th of July 1535. Now, the significance of the execution of Thomas More can be seen fivefold. It showed that in Henrican England, loyalty to the king on its own was not enough. You now had to prove you meant what you said. More would become a martyr to the Catholic cause. It created fear within England, with many fearing the consequences of speaking out. To many, the execution of such a distinguished scholar outraged many and discredited Henry VIII, and finally the Pope threatened to excommunicate Henry, who meant that those living under his reign would not be buried, married, or have any religious ceremonies conducted. So what we've got on this slide is a type of spider diagram. We want you to look at the significance of More's execution, and I've mentioned at least 5 of them previously, and we've got 4 of those here. So we've got a couple of tasks we'd like you to do. First of all, who do you think was the greatest threat to Henry? Decide who you think was the greatest threat and why. But importantly, we want you to make sure you explain your reasons why you think this. So having made the point, back it up with evidence. You may wish to consider the impact of their opposition. Did it have a limited impact, or did it have a greater impact of people? We've often talked about creating revision cards or cue cards. We've got examples here. So we've got the 3, Elizabeth Barton, John Fisher, Sir Thomas More. So on one side of the card you have the name, and then on the flip side you can write out some of those key things. So again, as a summary, for Elizabeth Barton, known as the Nun of Kent, claimed Henry would die if he married Anne Boleyn, prophesies Henry's death, and eventually was charged with treason and executed. John Fisher, we've got, supported Catherine, refused to swear the oaths of supremacy and succession, was made a cardinal by the Pope but still executed. And for Sir Thomas More, attacked Luther and advised Henry on his works on attacking Luther, refused to ask the Pope to sign a letter annulling his marriage to Catherine, and was against the divorce. These are very good ways of helping with your revision, and in fact you can use these also with many of the acts that you would have looked at under the reign of Henry VIII. So we now come to our exit quiz. So who was the Nun of Kent? Who did Bishop John Fisher encourage to invade England? And what position had Sir Thomas More held under Henry VIII? Once you've done that, you can then move on to the next slide and we can see the answers. Hopefully we've got all of these right. Elizabeth Barton, Charles V and Lord Chancellor. Again, if you didn't get any of the questions right, please write them out in full sentences. So hopefully at the end of this lesson you now have a good idea as to the 3 main people who opposed Henry and the reasons for their opposition.